All right. So it's so much fun being the buzzkill in a Bitcoin conference. And yes, I do work for a state. I am not the Wyoming Secretary of State. I'm just the deputy. So, yeah. But not a Fed. Not a Fed. I'm a statey, okay? But I'm going to have everybody up here introduce themselves. So,
Hi, everyone. I'm Brandon Sheiner, former ASHRAE New York City president, also founder of Sheiner Energy Engineering, consulting engineering firm in New York City area, and chief engineering officer of Promethean Innovations. We have Satoshi outside as our machine. Nice to meet you all.
Very nice. Awesome. Well, Shane Smith, I'm at Alera Group. Alera Group, we're an insurance brokerage for emerging industries and digital assets. We're the 14th largest insurance brokerage in the world. We have global capacity. And then my team that I lead up is emerging industries and digital assets. We're insuring everything from rocks to rockets. We just trademarked that as well, so pretty excited. But so for the Bitcoin space, we've been working on how do we create fair pricing, fair models, how do we underwrite for things that haven't existed, and then we're also tooling and building AI on decentralized networks in order to underwrite for the future of what we see as insurance. So,
Hey everyone, Zack Cohen from the Bitcoin Policy Institute. If you're not familiar, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C., working on federal Bitcoin policy. We've got that poster over there, Satoshi needs you to save our wallets. That's one of our key initiatives. So yeah, basically federal issues primarily, a little bit on the state and local level as well.
Hey everyone, I'm Seth Baylis. I'm a CPA at Satoshi Pacioli Accounting, so we're kind of the leading Bitcoin native accounting firm. So we work with a lot of your favorite Bitcoiners and their businesses, and glad to be here.
all righty. So we have lots of different levels of regulation. It's a pretty broad topic. We've got financial, we've got, well, financial with you too, federal, legal, and local. So let's start at local level. What things are you facing right now trying to get hash rate heating allowed at, in like building codes and things like that? How are you working with that?
Sure. So ASHRAE New York City is the New York City chapter of ASHRAE, but ASHRAE is actually global, just to let you know. So ASHRAE, just to give you a bit of background, is also a nonprofit focused on creating standards and guidelines within the building science MEP space. So anything from a boiler to a hot water heater to refrigeration systems, all of that, HVAC and R type of systems and equipment. They create standards also in the energy space as well. What happens is codes, so whether it's international building codes or local state codes, things like that, will look to other organizations that create these standards. ASHRAE is one of them and is definitely the leading one within our space. They will create standards and guidelines, which then get adopted into codes by reference, right? So technically, we are not a requirement until a building code references us and says you can comply via ASHRAE 90.1, whatever they end up referencing. One of the biggest hurdles, I would say, is just a complete lack of documentation at the moment from most of the Bitcoin industry. Everything from overseas miners to the systems that you may even see here are still a lot of them in the developing stage. And the amount of documentation that goes behind a UL listed, certified, anything is substantial and generally lacking currently. That would be one of, I would say, the biggest initiatives collectively, from everything down to the chip manufacturer through whatever system it's going into, really needs to take place before you would see this at least at like a commercial scale, not like residential backyards where maybe no one is bothering anybody for it. But yeah, documentation and system performance.
All right, that's something I've faced. We're installing some facilities in Wyoming, and even in Wyoming, where we're typically a lower regulation environment, they still want to see UL certs and all this stuff, and yeah, it's been fun. Also, I would imagine that without those things, you're not going to be able to, even if inspectors will let you, or you're in an environment where the inspectors don't care, it might be difficult to get insurance on these things without the proper certification. So why don't you start talking about that?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I think one of the great things is there's more approvals and regulation around the things that are being approved, and I think if we can hit building codes, it helps us a ton. But one of the biggest issues that we've faced in insurance is truly the miseducation around Bitcoin itself. So when we're quoting a data centers, every carrier in the world wants it, seen as a great risk. If I go down the line and tell an insurance carrier, hey, I got a data center, it's up to code, it's got redundancies, it's a great risk, you should write it, and then I say it mines Bitcoin, it's an immediate declination across the whole entire US capacity. We have to go to London to insure it at this moment. We're re-educating insurance agents as well, but I think from my angle of things is, one, the code can be up to code. The second is re-education and bringing a bridge into the insurance market so people can see that it's not that scary. I was actually at dinner once with the chief underwriting officer of a very large insurance company, and he asked me, so if the data center burns down, where does all the Bitcoin go? And so with that kind of shows, again, the miseducation. So the more education we can get, the more regulations and codes we can hit, it tells a better story, and then us, by telling good stories, can then deliver better results to a whole industry. So that's our focus.
Well, as we all know, if the data center burns down, the Bitcoin goes through the pipes and ends up in the drug dealers' dens, right? So now, we've talked about local levels and some insurance issues. On the federal level, is there anything that you all can do to help mitigate this, or what are you seeing at the federal level going on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the one piece to just touch on with these two, and then I'll jump to your question, is I think the education piece is absolutely essential, and that's something that we've been working on for the past 4 years in Washington, which is, we had senators and people in the Department of Justice and whatever federal agency, whatever three-letter agency, just completely uneducated on Bitcoin. They thought it was the same as Ethereum, and all the classic kind of tropes that we deal with on a regular basis. And the thing that worked was putting credible research, credible case studies, and credible business people in front of these agencies, in front of these senators and congressmen, and saying, here are very legitimate businesses. They're mining Bitcoin. They're doing financial services for Bitcoin, whatever it may be. And this is just like good for our economy. This is good for innovation. This is like the American dream, right? And I know that there's a little bit of conflict around that term right now, but I think that's still kind of the narrative that we should be running with. And so again, I think on the education level for the Heatpunks here is, here are very legitimate businesses that are basically, heating with a different source, right? It's the same thing we've been seeing for however many hundreds of years. It's just a different kind of system that's doing that. And you should not be standing in the way of that. There's no risks to you, right? If we do these systems, and obviously we need to do them properly, and that's why we're here for this event, that you should be encouraging this, not discouraging it. To the federal question, I think my broad take here is that this isn't a federal question at this moment in time. One thing BPI has always been pretty clear on is we don't necessarily need wins in Washington, D.C. We just need them to kind of stay off our back, right? That's, again, why we launched the Legal Defense Fund for the Samurai Wallet developers. That's the reason we're pushing for developer protections in Washington, D.C. right now, is to keep the government from basically, pushing us away from the innovation that we're working on. And so I think it's the same thing for this, right? We're going to be monitoring the situation. I know that's kind of a meme now, but yeah, if anything comes up, then then it's time to activate. But at this moment in time, I think a lot of the work to be done is at the local level, building out these case studies, building out codes, right? UL listed, all those good things, and those are all at the local level. And so, just encourage folks here to work with your local regulators, because when one jurisdiction says, "Hey, we're encouraging this around here," other jurisdictions are going to pay attention to that.
Well, I left the tax guy for last, partially because taxes, but we don't pay those right now. But also because you got to have it built before hopefully, before you're making money, and then actually that comes to play. But also, you should talk about why you might want to be in at the beginning.
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that the IRS is kind of retarded. They're not, they're not sending their best. You know, I could.
Do they have such a thing?
I don't think they do. I mean, you know, a short story for you guys. I was interacting with the audit agent like last year, and she asked me what a Ponzi scheme was. So I had the pleasure of explaining that to an IRS agent. So never a dull day. But now I think the important thing with the IRS is just to document everything and keep your records clean and well. Because you know, if you're going to sit around and wait for the IRS to tell you guys what to do, you might as well pack it up and go home. You know, they're still struggling with the cost basis on the 1099 DA right now, let alone how do we, you know, tax this new industry with the, you know, it's kind of novel getting the one input with the two outputs with the BTUs and the Bitcoin. So I think the most important thing is, you know, taking a conservative stance at the beginning, making sure all your documents and records are in order so that one day when that regulation does come, you know, hopefully we got close to being, you know, buttoned up on the front end. And yeah, I think if I could just say, like, the most important thing with the IRS is just to be consistent and conservative and to not change around, you know, what you're doing. And so I think documentation is probably the most important thing.
Well, since nobody up here is talking about corporate structuring, I'll go ahead and do that. Yeah, the government guy talking about corporate structuring. Yeah. The one thing you might want to consider, it lays into taxes, it lays into insurance, it lays into liability, is making sure that you have a proper corporate structure underneath you, LLC, Inc., and you know, whatever else, depending on if you're doing something nonprofit. Obviously, you should have that because it ties together several of the other aspects up here in regulation. It's a little easier potentially to do your taxes if everything is properly segregated into a corporate structure. It definitely can segregate liability and all of that. You might want to look at, if you have partnership that's in multiple states, you might want to look at which state is the best to put your company in. It's Wyoming, by the way. But also, you know, insurance companies might be more likely to deal with you if you have the right corporate structure and things like that, rather than just being a sole proprietor or something like that. So, well, I kind of lost the train of thought there. So let's go with how about some questions? We want to go open to questions? Because I always find that often we can start talking but y'all probably have actual questions that we can answer for one of our multiple people. So why don't we do that? If you don't, I'll keep going.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question just for the camera. So the question is, what is the process like for getting a device or piece of equipment UL listed? And the short answer is painful, painful and expensive, but kind of necessary. So the way that most UL listings work it is for the exact piece of equipment, exactly as you show it to them. So if you change where a screw goes, you could potentially void the UL listing. Not even, if you change the type of screw that you're using, it could potentially void the UL listing. So getting your ducks in a row to make sure that you have kind of the final, or maybe not final, but a final market version before going into the UL listings is usually the recommendation. Because otherwise, if you make little changes here and there, that you void out anything that you had put a lot of time, effort, and money into to get the original UL listing. So the question was, is there anything currently on the market that is UL listed? To the best of my knowledge, there are not any systems or final pieces of equipment that are UL listed. There may be components that are UL listed, which is a step in the right direction, but ultimately for, like, you know, if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or something like that, and you go to buy an appliance, like typically that entire thing is going to be UL listed, not just the components. The components inside may also have their own UL listing, but the entire thing is also typically UL listed.
I will mention that if you're in the larger scale mining sector, then some aspects of that are UL listed, the various huts and things like that, but not all of them. So you can run into problems if you're building out a facility that where the local inspector says, I want to see this UL listing, and you might not have it, and that's a problem. So you might not have to get an engineering stamp. I think he was first.
How do we as an industry deal with the fact that a lot of our machines are coming out of China where they don't care to UL list any of this stuff? They aren't worried about our regulations. How do we deal with that from, say, like an insurance or federal perspective? Like, how do we move forward there?
All right, so he asked multiple people here about basically how do we deal with the fact that all the equipment is coming out of China on a local, federal, and at an insurance level. And then I'll throw it into the, I guess, you can talk about depreciation of the equipment when we get to taxes. So
We'll go down the line this way?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. So I would actually say I don't entirely agree with that sentiment. I think that China actually does care eventually about getting UL listed, because otherwise it will later prohibit them from being able to sell here. And America is a tremendous market for them in everything, like everything. So they actually do care. The documentation side is definitely lacking because this is an up-and-coming industry, and quite frankly, it just hasn't become enough of a problem for them yet. As soon as the UL listing does start to matter, they will take strides to get it. And a lot of the UL testing for a lot of pieces of equipment actually happens in China currently. So they have a lot of setups. I would say the validity of some of the tests you could sometimes look into with a skeptical eye. You know, but basically if you pay them enough to test it enough and, you know, update as needed to get to that point where it is UL, you know, listed and compliant, I think that they will, like the serious players in the space that are manufacturing anywhere, including China, will eventually need to get those UL listings.
And then, yeah, so on the side of like insurance for those components, so things coming from China or not being UL listed yet, that's actually one of the friction points that we have. So I think at the point where we can get them UL listed and up to like code or more US based, that we can like show that this is a good risk to underwrite, it helps us a lot. The one thing that I continue to have seen though with inside insurance was for this industry, it's kind of been abused in a sense. At the same time, it makes sense from, Bitcoin was new. In 2009, before that, Bitcoin wasn't a thing. The industry has been developing, and then with that, and as it matures, we can write better terms, better capacity, better limits. Some of the things that we've been working to is though, how do we create risk management and then loss reduction? And that's where we've actually partnered with some groups that digitally twin the mechanical, electrical, fire, life safety systems of buildings. With that, they can predictively prevent loss. And then we have restoration companies that are speed dial to deliver restoration gear. So in the sense that we've worked with miners and quoted them up, and then the cost is so high, they're like, why would I ever do this? Because it's going to take away so much of my ROI. So our recommendation is, hey, let's put something else into place and just risk manage the location, and you don't necessarily need an insurance policy always. But at the same time, as we get better UL listings and better codes, we can define better contracts to transfer that risk. Because if we can transfer that risk to an insurance policy, we see a lot of groups then access more capital and then accelerate their operations. So that's what we're looking to do.
On the federal level, I think maybe like November of 2025, maybe a little bit before that, we started getting a lot of questions from folks, particularly in Congress, asking about whether, you know, basically the Bitcoin mining hardware from Bitmain or whoever could basically like trigger like grid defaults and like blow up data centers, and, you know, they were so uneducated on like how a Bitcoin miner works. They thought, you know, China could just put this little like malware into the Bitcoin miner and then blow up our whole grid. And so, like, we've heard that narrative a lot. We've heard a lot of skepticism, and also from the Department of Commerce more recently, launching probes into hardware coming out of China. So I guess all that's to say, I think there are going to be incentives for American companies, maybe just non-Chinese companies, to start shipping hardware here to the United States. I don't have a particular comment on the UL listing component, but I do think from a federal policy level, there's certainly a skepticism right now about hardware coming out of China.
Yeah, I think, on like the depreciation side, it doesn't necessarily really matter where the miner comes from, but kind of what's most important is where the miner is placed in service. So, particularly with like 100% bonus depreciation right now, you need to have the miners in service and hashing, before the end of the year to qualify for the depreciation in that year. And then unfortunately, another thing we see some people miss sometimes is those miners have to be in America. And so if you have an operation overseas or elsewhere, you, at least for now, can't take that bonus depreciation. And then one other consideration is just the state you're operating in. So some states like California, they don't conform to federal bonus depreciation. So you kind of don't get the benefit at the state level as much as you do at the federal level. But yeah, most important thing we try to tell clients is making sure you have those miners in service before the end of the year, and then they actually need to be in America.
All right, you were next, but before I hand it over to you for the question, I had a follow-up on one of this, which is one of the things that we're hearing as is on the documentation, and the historically Bitmain and What's Miner and the other manufacturers have been less than forthcoming about documentation. So I guess I wanted to ask a little bit about, this might be just for Zack, but with this documentation, with these miners coming in and being kind of a lot more professional and getting all these UL certifications, is there a way that we could use those certifications to potentially argue that the lack of documentation might be a national security risk, so they really need to give us better documentation?
Certainly. Yeah, I think that's actually a good angle to approach this with, right? Which is, A, there's an education gap, and B, there's an actual information gap, which is, we don't actually know what's in these rigs. And so I think that's certainly an angle to say, hey, Bitmain, hey, whoever shipping basically mining rigs into the United States, like, we need a full sort of documentation of what's in here. Have these rigs been used before? Obviously, that's another major problem. And as has been mentioned, by the other panelists here, the United States is a huge market for these manufacturers. They do not want to risk a problem with the United States government. We've seen Bitmain representatives kind of popping up in Washington, D.C. They're sort of increasing their presence there, and so I think that's spot on, which is hey, if you want to keep selling your products here, A, we're going to need that information from you for national security reasons, which is always the perfect framing for anything you want done in Washington, D.C. But also, yeah, that transparency is really essential, and so I think that's certainly something we can push on.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one of the hard parts with insurance, there's so many issues with it, to be honest. But the thing that we see is carriers have the ability to just say no to anything that they don't want to. And again, the biggest thing that we're trying to do from the education standpoint is they say no just to Bitcoin. If you bring up Bitcoin, they're going to decline it. We have carriers that are like, we have some that are fully denominated in Bitcoin. We have some that are putting policies on chain. They're on unregulated paper, and they're like making a stand and coming out and trying to start a new market. But the biggest pain point that I see is if we can continue to educate the bigger carriers and we can start underwriting and using capacity that already exists, it's going to help us a lot. I look at everything as a machine and infrastructure, and there's a massive machine and infrastructure that exists to provide insurance for all these components. We just need to educate them to allow a connection for us to start insuring those assets there. And it's been a big driver. But I think the more UL listings, the more things that we can show that this is up to code. And then one of the things, if we can start working even with carriers to get some of these components in front of them and say, this is what it is, and they approve it, then it gives us an immediate stamp of approval that the next time they see it, they don't have to deep dive. They just say, that's an approved product, and we'll insure that.
Can I jump in now? I just want to say, I think, another important factor that you brought up is, if you're sort of having success building what you're building and you're not experiencing these barriers, like, keep building, right? And I'm sure that's the sentiment in here, but I wanna kind of double tap that. And then I think the next step, like I was saying in the first comment I made, is document what you've done. Say, so and so approved this. This went through the whatever inspection process, and this is something that we should be sort of expanding outward, right? Because it sounds like I'm not a pro on UL listing. Obviously, kind of more at the federal level on other issues, but I think the logic remains the same, which is you take a case where someone has done this successfully, they're running a legitimate business, they've passed whatever inspections they go through. You take that to the regulator. You say, hey, look, like this is what's happening here. We need to do something. We need to codify this in some way. We want you to encourage this kind of behavior in your jurisdiction. And then you get one, and then you get two, and then it's exponential from there. I think that's really the way that we get good regulation here is documentation, as has been said multiple times, and then showing regulators, hey, we're complying with all the rules that we're supposed to be complying with. There are people doing this in other districts or other jurisdictions. You should be encouraging this too.
I'll get to you in a second because that brings up a follow-up here. Let's say I know that in some cases when you're building out, you can get engineered stamps, and that covers a multitude of sins with what you're building, especially if they're not to code. I've had code inspectors say, well, if the engineer says it's good, I don't care. So two follow-ups on how is that being used on the ground in this field, and also let's say you're building this out, can you get any are there any tax breaks or research breaks for things like that you might be able to apply on your taxes?
Okay, so these are some loaded questions. I don't know what it is elsewhere, but I would say that is typically not how it happens in New York City. I would say that for the most part, UL listings, other testing is actually to move the responsibility and liability back to the manufacturer, which is what every specifying engineer, architect, anyone kind of wants, right? Because the more you take on that isn't known, when something goes wrong, now it's on you. I've had very different experiences than what you just described with inspectors coming on site, and you could prove to them that it's code compliant, that it was signed off by whatever licensed professional, and if it's not the way that they like it, they may still say no. And to a certain extent, that is within their authority as an inspector if there's a valid reason behind it.
Well, the valid reason, by the way, in Vegas is your envelope wasn't thick enough.
So that's a whole nother problem. Fortunately, not something I have any personal experience with, so I won't speak to it. But yeah, I would say the more that you do without other certifications or a licensed professional engineer or licensed professional that can sign off on something, the more you take on the risk, right? So a little bit in contrast to what you were mentioning about, like, if you're not getting a problem, just keep going. I would say be cautious, because if you're not having a problem now, that doesn't mean that when you get to number 100, you won't have a problem, and now that problem applies to all 100. So you want to tackle your problems while they're small. Make sure that if you're building something and it doesn't yet have a UL listing or something like that, that you are strictly following the codes that you need to, so that even if you're not UL listed, you would be UL compliant. there's a difference between listed and compliant, right? You can comply with codes. You can comply with all of that. Your system can comply with every aspect of it. That doesn't make you listed. And quite frankly, even though it shouldn't work this way, sometimes you get ones that are listed that actually don't comply with like certain parts of it, and that's a whole other problem. But yeah, I would say proceed boldly but cautiously with that approach, because just because it's not a problem now doesn't mean it won't be a problem later. And if you're doing something that is not backed by any other certification, and especially if it's not compliant with certain codes, that doesn't make it not a problem. It makes it a bigger problem, and the later you catch it, the bigger the problem and more expensive it will be for you.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously not like a hashrate Heatpunk tax credit at the moment. You know,
Get on that, Zack.
You know, in the same way that you could get a credit for putting like solar panels on your roof. But you probably have a little bit more flexibility when it comes to like research and development, and maybe getting a credit on that side of things. So I think it'll probably be a while until we have that the Heatpunk credit, but I'd love to see it.
Yes. So, absolutely. So to reframe the question from insurance carriers, they're in it to make money, very true. And then what are we seeing from how things could change? So how I'll answer that is, so what I've seen in insurance, so I cut my teeth in insurance doing large and complex real estate risks. So I had multi-billion-dollar portfolios. When you're working on portfolios of that size, every dot on the I's need to be dotted and T's slashed. So we were held to a very strict standard that it needs to be perfect every single time. And then due to passion, I shifted myself into emerging industries and digital assets to ensure Bitcoin miners, data centers, and everything else. What I recognized was a data center gets 10 cents is the underwriting component that they get, and Bitcoin miners is 70 cents to $1.24. So astronomically higher. And the issues that I see with insurance is I look at insurance that it needs to protect people. And I think with AI and all these other components that we're doing internally of building AI underwriters and building a better machine for getting this done is going to just change insurance completely. But where I see there is a big incentive structure that is false is now Bitcoin miners are paying astronomical prices. Other people entering the market are like, well, why would we offer them 10 cents when I can offer them 60? And then we can drop them to 50, and then we can drop them further. And then people are making tons of money with inside that band, when I think it just needs to be level set and we underwrite it to the true risk profile of it, and then allow insurance to be what insurance is supposed to be. It's supposed to be something that provides protection for you. It's not supposed to be something that people make boatloads of money off of. So, yeah.
But I guess you're missing my point. Yeah. Because they're very happy to insure data centers, right? Why is it then when you mention the word Bitcoin, what is the trigger? Why do you think that exists in the industry?
So, question is, why do they want to insure data centers, but Bitcoin is the trigger for them not wanting to insure it? So the big thing is it's the education component, because I have to instruct them all the time that, hey, I want you to cover the infrastructure. I want coverage on the building, and I want coverage on the miners themselves. And then the constant sticking point is Bitcoin's super volatile. How do we ensure the business interruption to the company? And we say we don't need the insurance on the volatility of Bitcoin. What we need insurance for is the infrastructure and building itself. So right now it's so that we need the education, because we're fighting with them to say, we open up your capacity so we can put the property risk on your balance sheets. We just want property coverage. We don't want you to insure the component of Bitcoin. And then due to them not understanding Bitcoin, they're like, well, what's going to happen? We're scared because of the word Bitcoin. And then they can just decline and put it into their underwriting that we're just not going to offer any capacity for anything associated with the industry. So that's what we need to change on my end.
I think it's also not just insurance, right? Recently, we were looking at the Bank of International Settlements and their Basel III sort of regulatory framework, and there's a 100% reserve requirement for banks to hold Bitcoin, right? It's ludicrous. I mean, it's just like absurd and completely sort of out of whack. And this is just another point of that. So not just insurance. I think it's worth at least saying that.
Well, we're out of time but I did want to point out that one of the other aspects, at least in the insurance industry, go back to banking, like he said. I mean, up until recently, a lot of Bitcoin companies were getting debanked still just because they touched Bitcoin. So I think the insurance industry may be a little downstream of the banking industry in that respect, and just they're not quite there yet. Although that does mean that somebody could open up a mutual or a captive and take advantage of some tax credits.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's one of the big things. We are seeing that. So there are some really fun things happening in the insurance industry right now, and there's so many great people. I don't want to dog on the whole industry or the carriers we work with. They're great partners. We love them. But there are new things coming out. There's new captive structures being designed right now. There's policies being put on chain. I think we're going to see a monumental shift in the insurance industry with AI, Bitcoin, and I'm excited for the future because I think it's going to change a lot of things. So.
Let's give a round of applause to our great panel and moderator here. Thank you, everybody.